Going live here. All right, we are live. Joining me today is an extra special guest. I guess I should have asked you before we started exactly how you pronounce your first name. Is it George Northoff or Georg?
George or Georg Northoff. Say George is easier for the audience.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that. Sorry about that, George. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me today. And for those who don't know you, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, and thank you for inviting. I appreciate. Yeah, I'm by training, I'm a medical doctor and a philosopher. So, and I have degrees in medicine, neuroscience, and philosophy, and I'm also practicing psychiatrist. So I still see some patients. And my main research is really around sort of this triangle between philosophy, neuroscience, and psychiatry. And it's really about how to understand mind-brain relationship. And you also see that I will turn towards world-brain relationships in order to understand mind-brain relationships. I'm practicing and researching in Ottawa, a little bit north of you in New York.
Oh, right. How are things up there with respect to the current situation, the pandemic? Are they as bad as they are elsewhere?
It is not as dramatic, but it's the same here. I'm locked in. We're basically not allowed to go out. And I think we are not as crowded as you guys. And I think they took some more preemptive measures here. And now they just instructed today, I just said that they instructed all the companies to produce the kind of material which is needed, like the masks and protection gears and so on. So I think Canada somewhat handled it well, but of course we are affected by it strongly. Yeah.
Yeah, it really matters how the leadership handles it in this case. So that's nice to hear.
That's certainly true. Yeah.
Hasn't been so excellent down here, one might say, but
I think as a Canadian, I share that.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you because I'm a big fan of interdisciplinary work, and I really admire people that do the hard work of the interdisciplinariness. So it's one thing to be interested in neuroscience and philosophy. It's another thing to have degrees in those things and to try to use. I guess I would say you take a kind of neurophilosophical approach to identify with that tradition using neuroscience to help understand philosophical problems. Is that an accurate way of thinking about your work?
Yeah, I think it's a very good characterization. But as you know, in philosophy, it's all about terms. You can understand the term neurophilosophy in different ways. So originally, the term was introduced by Patricia Churchill in 1986. And she really suggested basically, okay, let's look to neuroscience to resolve philosophical issues. And that sort of has a very strong presupposition that maybe philosophical issues can be reduced to neuroscientific questions. And that's something that's sort of what I would call a reductive neurophilosophy. But that's an approach which I not fully share, because philosophical issues have a certain level of analysis, conceptual, ontological, epistemological issues, which are not completely resolvable by empirical issues. So these are all different methodological ways of accessing reality. You see, that's already a strong statement. And they cannot be reduced to each other. So that's why I suggest sort of a non-reductive form of neurophilosophy. And I'm saying that because the concept of neurophilosophy has somewhat come into dispute over the last couple of years, where they say it couldn't really resolve the issues. But that concerns mainly reductive neurophilosophy. So for me, it's important, yes, ontological questions, issues are important, separate from empirical issues, but the empirical issues can guide and inform the ontological analysis. So we can have more empirically plausible assumption about existence and reality, ontology, or empirically less plausible ontological assumption. And neurophilosophy is for me to have empirically plausible assumption. My Freudian unconscious.
Yeah. Right. We want the plausible ones, not the implausible.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's really a nice distinction there between the reductive versus non-reductive neurophilosophy. I hadn't really encountered it before, so I think it's a nice way of handling some of the criticisms that have come to the earlier approaches.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm preempting them. And that's gives you also a different view. Also gives you the view maybe to link some of the history of philosophy, like Kant, like Schopenhauer actually brought in the brain, to current neurophilosophy and neuroscience. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of Kant, I know that you mentioned him a few times in your work. And part of this has to do with the idea that Kant was one of the earliest philosophers to reject this kind of passive model of the mind, where the mind is like a video camera receiving input from the external world. And he argues for a more active interpretation, where the mind is actively constructing experiences. And in your book, you argue that kind of either side of this issue is too extreme, and you have what you call the spectrum model, which incorporates elements of both of them. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that before we go. I mean, just specifically starting with the brain, and get to the mind later.
Yeah, I mean, you already hit upon the historical context. So Hume and Locke had a passive model of mind. It's just a receiver of input. And then, of course, the question is, how is it possible that mental features like self-consciousness come about? Then Kant reverted to the opposite extreme and said, okay, the mind is spontaneous in an absolute way. And in order to prove that, he went into the logical dimensions and the categories. And that, of course, is again, absolute spontaneity. And I think when you look at the empirical data of the brain, neither extreme fits the data. So if you have a purely passive model of brain, it doesn't fit the data, because the brain has a spontaneous activity which continuously shapes the input. So meaning that the people who listen, when you listen to me, you perceive it in a very different way, what I say, than another person, because the two of you have different kinds of spontaneous activity patterns. So your input is shaped by the spontaneous activity. So meaning it's no longer purely passive. Yeah.
Right.
The other extreme, if there is pure activity, then the whole perception and cognition would be determined by the spontaneous activity alone, and your external stimulus input would have no impact at all. That's basically an extreme consequence of Kant put into neuroscience. But that's not true either. Yeah. So it's really an interaction. Yeah. So that's why a purely active / spontaneous model of the brain and a purely passive model of brain, in the sense of Hume, neither fits the bill. So we need a spectrum model. And you have, when you have, for instance, psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, there's a spontaneous activity has a much stronger impact than in the healthy brain. So indeed, you have shifts. That's why I speak of a spectrum as a continuum, a spectrum of different constellations of active and passive components, if you want to say so.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point too, about especially like when you're thinking of auditory hallucinations with schizophrenia. So there's evidence that, I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit, because we should talk about the default mode network, which I think is what you mean, or partially what you mean by spontaneous activity. So that was one of the questions I had when I was reading the book, because spontaneous activity is, in some sense, defined as stimulus-free activity, or when there's not a specific stimulus which you are engaging with. And so anyway, let me ask you, what exactly do you mean by spontaneous activity?
Yeah, and you may be surprised. It's a very difficult question. Yeah, and it's a very fair question. It sounds banal. So let me just first maybe draw a comparison. So you have the seaside. Yeah, you go to the seaside. It's not long from Long Island. Unfortunately, it's quite far here from Ottawa, because I love the sea. So you have spontaneous internal dynamics of your waves. Yeah. There's a very strong waves and so on. And then there comes the wind that sort of modulates the wave, the sea waves. Yeah. So same in the case of the brain. So you have a certain spontaneous intrinsic dynamics. The system is always active. It's continuously changing. This is very, very important. This is very hard for us to grasp, because we usually think in very static terms. We observe at one particular point in time and another, and then we say, okay, these are all independent states. What is important in the brain, and this is very clear, it's the degree of change from one time point to another. That is relevant. And if the brain doesn't change anymore, then you lose consciousness and you become anesthetic or comatose. That's also what the data show. Change is important. However, change, as we all know, can occur in a more structured way, in a more organized way, or just change completely blind, completely random. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and oh God, I don't have a good comparison now, but let's go back to my C examples. You can have a lot of small chaotic waves where there's absolutely no structure, and the surfer will not be able to properly surf on that. However, now you go to the other part of your country, meaning to Hawaii, you have a very structured, big waves, long lasting, and some small waves. So there's a very good structure ideal for surfing. So now imagine these sea waves are your brain's spontaneous activity, and your external stimuli, your input, is basically like the surfer riding on these waves. Yeah?
Yeah.
So, and then, however, the brain is more complicated. Imagine now the surfer has an impact on the shape of the waves at the next time point. So basically the surfer can sort of modulate the shape of the wave. That's what happens in the brain. Your spontaneous waves, activity waves, are continuously shaped also by the external environment. They're
Right.
plastic, if you want to say so. So plasticity.
Right. So, so when we're looking at neurodynamics with EEG or fMRI or whatever tool we're using, how do we define the conditions under which the activity is spontaneous as opposed to the conditions that are stimulus driven? Because when the eyes are open, I mean, I know in the book you specifically say it's not just eyes closed, it's not resting state. That's not what you mean by spontaneous activity. So you can be having that when your eyes are open, but there's always going to be stimuli impinging on your sensory apparatus, even when your eyes are open. So in what sense is that activity truly spontaneous or internally generated as opposed to being modulated by the environment, like at all times?
Yeah, good. I think, again, there's a spectrum of spontaneity. There is no absolute spontaneity. There isn't. Kant was wrong in that. And Kant was probably wrong in that because he reverted in the second part of his critique of pure reason, the transcendental logic. He reverted to the logical domain and to the categories. And then you have concepts which are all or nothing. Either something is present and it's logically, or it's not present and it's not logical. So that dichotomy of concepts apparently does not apply to the empirical level, or ultimately, I would also say, to the ontological level. So there you already see an important difference between a purely logical philosophical approach and a more neurophilosophical approach. Yeah. And now I break it down to the empirical level, because when you say we speak of task-evoked activity, so you see me, suddenly I come into the picture and you see me. Yeah, so your brain induces some activity. However, that activity is a mixture between the ongoing spontaneous dynamics and the activity I, as an external input for your brain, induces. And that's hybrid. And that we haven't really understood. So we have major lines of research going currently on in my group to understand this hybrid nature. Which component of task evoked is a carryover from the spontaneous activity, the preceding pre-stimulus, in which part of the activity we observe is related to the external stimulus. And again, you mentioned the example of schizophrenia. We have papers submitted in Work and Research where we can really show that the schizophrenic patients are not properly able to distinguish between internal activity and external stimulus. So they basically mold in the external stimulus within their internal activity. And then, of course, they perceive the external stimulus in terms of their internal activity and their own beliefs.
Right.
Yeah. And then I have hallucinations, or I have the feeling that the way you look at me, that means you want to kill me. And things like that. Now you know my beliefs. Yeah. Oh, things like that. Yeah.
Right. So I'm trying to connect this to sort of more traditional ways of thinking about these sorts of things. And I wonder, so would it be wrong to say that by spontaneous activity, you mean something like top-down activity, and by stimulus-driven is bottom-up, or these categories, are they orthogonal to what you're saying? Or do they map on in a reasonable way? Or
yeah, it depends on, of course, how you understand top-down and bottom-up. But if you want to say so, you can say it. I mean, it was probably more an internally driven versus externally driven activity. So you have externally oriented cognition, perception when I perceive you, but however, you might not really listen to what I say. You just continue your own internal thoughts. Then your internally cognition prevails over the external cognition. So it's a balance between
right.
internally oriented. If you mean that by top down, bottom up, I would subscribe to that.
Yeah. So, one way, like in traditional psychology textbooks, they present this stuff as, well, you have the sensory cortices are receiving input, from the LGN and so forth. And then you have the sort of higher areas, which are interpreting that kind of activity. Maybe there is even schema that are, it's being compared to, and those sorts of things. And so I was wondering, because you come at this from a really neuroscientific approach. And so as I was reading the book, I was trying to connect some of these more psychological concepts to the work that you're doing. But I wasn't really sure if that was the right way of interpreting your work or not, or if you think that maybe that's a mistake, because towards the end, you end up saying things like you're going to get rid of the mind altogether in a certain sense, as a substrate for these capacities or properties that we talk about. So I'm wondering if maybe the avoidance of psychological terms was maybe purposeful or not in your work.
Yeah. So for the audience, yes, I get rid of the mind, but it doesn't mean that I get rid of mental features.
Right.
I do not get rid of the sense of self. I do not get rid of consciousness. I do not get of what you assume with free will. What I get rid of, that they say that these mental features have specific representations, isolated as isolated entities or natural kinds, as philosophers like to say, in the brain. So this is very important, so that people don't get me wrong. And in our tradition, we have often associated mental features in mind. For the psychological terms, I think you're right. With the higher order, lower networks, ultimately, I would argue that mental features are associated with a certain balance, with a certain structure, organizations along the lines of higher order, lower network. And it is no doubt that higher order, lower networks have differential dynamic. They have different spatial features. Higher order networks are more connected to the rest of the brain. They show strong power in the slow frequencies, meaning they have a lot of strong, slow waves. They are good for surfing. Whereas the sensory cortex shows less connectivity to all the other regions of the brain. And they have a lot of fast waves, which might suit them better to encode and process the fast stimuli from the environment. So no doubt there is something to this. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, just to clarify the thing we were talking about with respect to the mental features. So you think consciousness is a real feature of the brain, or I mean, obviously the brain's interaction with the world, the relation that it has to the world, which I think is where you end up. But it is a real feature of human beings, correct? Even if you want to say this, the mental substrate is the wrong way to associate it.
Yeah. So I think, let's say, John Searle had said, okay, he compares consciousness to digestion. Yeah. If you
Right.
conceive it in a biological process, is like an output of a biological system. Yes, I agree. In that sense, consciousness is a real feature. However, now assuming a substrate underlying consciousness as distinct from non-consciousness, that's something I would not do. Yeah, because there's a continuum. I would rather say a biological system, there's a continuum. Of course, that's for me the spatial temporal dynamic. And if that is in a certain state, if it serves a certain organization, then consciousness is brought forth. Same with digestion. Your stomach exists independent of digestion. If your stomach is properly organized with all its enzymes, then digestion happens. However, as a medical doctor, I know that the presence of the stomach does not guarantee digestion. Yeah, and many stomach disorder people can tell you. Yeah, so the stomach is not the substrate. The relevance is here the dynamics, the interaction, the configuration, the structure, organization. You see the kind of terms I'm using between the different enzymes, and that makes possible digestion. Now, same for consciousness. You have a certain space-time dynamics in your brain. Yeah, you have a certain constellation of fast and slow waves across higher and lower order regions, as you say, sensory regions, cognitive regions. And that configuration, that structure of space-time dynamics then determines whether you can have consciousness or not.
So I wonder if we could just stop for a second and de-ambiguate the term consciousness, because I know you're careful in your book and your work to distinguish the ways that we use the term consciousness, and then you have an account for each specific kind. I'm going to ask you about phenomenal consciousness in a second, but I wonder if you could just set the stage a little bit by saying how do you understand the term consciousness? How do you disambiguate it?
Okay, one thing one cannot say that your questions are not hard and tough.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate it because it's right to the point. That's what you need, but it's a good one. Yeah, so I think consciousness, let's say, I just give again sort of a very quick historical spectre. You see often at the beginning of when philosophical concept, consciousness was a philosophical concept, obviously, for centuries. And not even always in philosophy. The ancient Greeks, they didn't discuss much about consciousness. It was came up with Descartes and then Locke and empiricism and so on. Yeah. However, and when a concept starts in the empirical science, usually the cause of that it gets sliced up, so that you have different features, different aspects. A typical example is the limbic system. Nowadays, neuroscientists will not talk much about limbic system. They talk about specific regions like hippocampus, amygdala, blah, blah, blah. 50 years ago, people just spoke about the limbic system. And my hope, the same will happen with consciousness, that it will be sliced up in different aspects. What are the different aspects? I don't know, but of course I have my own guesses. One, of course, is definitely the phenomenal aspect of what it is like, phenomenal features, what is it like to be bad, Thomas Nagel. However, phenomenal features are again not phenomenal features. There are a variety of phenomenal features beautifully described in particular phenomenology. This goes from qualia, this goes from temporal continuity, William James, stream of consciousness. Inner time consciousness, protension, retention, Husserl. Beautiful descriptions and really true descriptions. Sense of self, different senses of self, ipseity. Then the qualia themselves, intentionality. I haven't even mentioned that. So I think what we need when we talk about phenomenal consciousness, we need to slice up the concept of phenomenal here and distinguish between different features. In my Unlocking the Brain, volume 2, that's about consciousness, where I try to link these different phenomenological features of consciousness to different neurodynamical mechanisms. And I think that's the direction to go. Yeah, the traditional nowadays, you have a distinction between level and content of consciousness. The concept of level is also more and more sliced up. For instance, Tim Bain in recent papers, very nice papers. Initially, consciousness 20 years ago was related to the content of consciousness. And I think a third dimension would be needed. That goes very much also to Kant and phenomenology, is the form or the structure of consciousness, the organization. Yeah. So there you see.
Is that related to what philosophers call the unity of consciousness, or is that a?
Yeah, probably. It could be, but you can have, again, different meanings of unity. You can have a meaning of cognitive unity, which is probably the unity Kant and Tim Bain and analytic philosophy means. Then there is a more phenomenological concept of unity, the experience of unity, which probably goes back to Husserl and phenomenological, then Zahavi, current philosophers. And then there's the access versus phenomenal conscious. So access unity, I think I've also heard. So you see the same concept can be used in different contexts, /phenomenological, analytic, empirical, and it might attain slightly different meanings there. And that's a difficult thing, because you need to link these different meanings. Otherwise, it's just a mapping, and that always leaves a gap by default.
Yeah. So with respect to phenomenal consciousness, I mean, so you identify that or correlate it with, or whatever, I don't know what the right word term is. That's something I want to ask you about, but with what you call neural expansion. Is that, so can you say a little bit about what that concept is?
Yeah, okay. Now that's another very good question, and I like that very much. So Gregor Buzaki, a famous neuroscientist, he says consciousness goes beyond the stimulus. That's literally true. So he says perception goes beyond the stimulus, but I extend that to consciousness. So what do I mean by that? So when you're conscious of something, that event or person might already be physically absent, but you're still conscious. So somehow there's a fleeting moment, you're conscious, it's still in your consciousness, but it already is away. It's no longer physically present. So you have a phenomenal presence with combined a physical absence. In schizophrenia, this is taken to the extreme, where they have hallucination of something that is physically completely absent, has never been there, but it's phenomenally present. And that's why they're so convinced about it. So for me, consciousness is going beyond the actual time-space properties of the physical features, of the physical stimulus. So your brain does something to the input. Your input comes in, your input is already, the tone of the melody is already superseded by the next tone. However, you still hear the previous tone in relation to the present tone, and so forth. So your brain somehow seems to extend or expand that stimulus. And that's what I would argue does the spontaneous activity and the space-time features. So it's a virtual, it's really, that I really believe, it's a virtual expansion, and your consciousness, in a sense, it's a virtual thing compared to the physical reality.
It's a virtual thing in the sense that it goes beyond the physical thing. That's the sense.
Exactly. Yeah, physically in your experience. It doesn't mean that ontologically I'm a metaphysician here. So be careful. See, I try to guard myself. Yeah.
Exactly.
You know what comes. Yeah. Exactly. So that's very important. On a phenomenological, on an experiential sense, it's already physically absent, but phenomenologically is still present. Yeah.
Right.
And it's present for me, that I would argue, in a temporal spatial way, because it's virtually expanded. Yeah. It goes beyond the actual physical features of the stimulus. Yeah.
And so where neurally are we going to find this kind of going beyond? So it's not going to be in the like low level visual areas, I assume, not, V1, V2 or whatever, but by the time we get up to V5, are we having color experiences? Is that where you're going to locate them? Or, I guess they're going to be located with the relation to the world. That's somehow going to get into here as well.
Let me, maybe I bring up the comparison with the surfer. I'm not sure whether it works, but so surfer starts, okay? So he's somewhat surfing, not really fast, but it starts. Okay, that's V1, V2, V3. Then he get really into the groove of the ongoing wave, yeah? So now the stimulus gets more processed through the other regions. It really gets into the groove of the slow wave stuff and all the other regions. It gets faster and faster and better groove, and the surfer can conserve better. That's during that course, stimulus, the consciousness develops. Now you ask me where at that chain you will have consciousness. I would say that completely depends upon the context and so on. You cannot say it's either in V5 or it's either in there. Depends upon the stimulus properties, depends upon your state of the spontaneous activity dynamic at the entrance of the stimulus. In the same way, the groove of the surfer depends at which time point she or he joined the wave. Same thing here.
Yeah. So would you say then that the kind of traditional search for the neural correlates of consciousness, in your view, is kind of proceeding in the incorrect way, trying to find, traditionally, going back to Chalmers' work, is to find the minimal neural activity that's necessary and sufficient for a certain conscious experience?
I think as a criterion, it's right and it's good. But of course, we need to go beyond the neural correlates, that's clear. But I do not think that we find this neural correlate in specific regions.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that we find it in specific spatial-temporal dynamical constellations. Let's say relationship between V5 and prefrontal cortex. And that V5 prefrontal cortex characterized by certain dynamics, which strong slow waves, but also some fast waves. If the same V5 prefrontal constellations only exhibits the slow waves, but not the fast waves, the stimulus will be processed, but not become conscious. So I'm relying in part on data here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope that gives you an idea how I put this into more dynamic space-time context.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting, because I thought that part of what you ended up saying was that, like, for instance, take the global workspace or the global neuronal workspace theory. I thought part of the view was that stuff broadcast to prefrontal cortex and available to a lot of systems is going to be required for reporting, but not for conscious experience, on your view. But now I thought that you were just saying that there is some relation to those to PFC, some kind of dynamic interplay between them, which is in some cases going to be required for conscious experience. So, yeah. But that's not the same as global broadcasting. So I'm wondering what the distinction is.
Yeah, good point. So in the case of the global neuronal workspace theory, as I understand it, and the theory has a lot of excellent empirical data, absolutely, no doubt. But I agree, it's probably more related to access of consciousness, becoming aware that I'm conscious.
Right.
And the problem is here, I think they start with single regions, and then they say, how do these single regions get access to the global workspace? I would argue, let's say you start in V1, but that V1 already shows in the resting state a lot of interaction with the prefrontal cortex and all other regions of the brain. So you cannot say that spontaneous activity at the onset of the stimulus is purely V1.
Right.
It's already interrelated with the prefrontal and the slow waves and the faster waves and so on and so on. It's the same thing. Imagine a group of people. You have 10 people, yeah, all standing in a circle, and somehow some people have a history with each other and some people do not. So now 11 person come in. That person, how the person will be received by the overall group also depends upon your previous relations among the members of the 10 people. So in a way, there's already a global component prior even to the onset of the stimulus. So you see, in the global neuronal workspace theory, the global component is at the very end. It's the apex. Mm-hmm. It's a higher order. That's why it's now linked with higher order cognitive theories, David Rosenthal, Hakam Lau, yeah, higher order theories. However, I would say there's already global activity all the way already at the spontaneous level. And what you see when your incoming stimulus is just modulate that relationship of the global activity to V1. We have a paper in print where we show that the global activity has representations in different cortical regions, including V1 in different ways. So your global activity, that basically, I start with a global activity and then say, okay, the stimulus just modulates the global to local relationship. So it's the other.
I would just want to, before moving on, I just want to kind of distinguish the higher order approaches from the global workspace approaches. They both involve prefrontal cortex and higher cognitive functioning, they're sort of underneath very different. So for the higher order stuff from Rosenthal, you need a kind of inner awareness, an awareness of the mental functioning, whereas that's not required in any way in the global workspace. Global workspace theory is a first order theory, kind of
Right.
straightforwardly.
Yeah. No, I would go with that. I would go with
Okay.
that. But
Okay.
I would say I would not go even with the first order approach again, because I think it's not wrong. For access, it's very good and it has fantastic empirical data. Very good stuff. However, I don't think that it explains the phenomenal features.
Right.
Yeah? And that's where I think you need the global, and you need the global very early on, and you need the time-space dynamics.
Yeah, and this is sort of a tangential, but since it's come up, I do wonder why, with your emphasis on phenomenology and the history of that, why you don't consider higher order theories more specifically in the recent book, at least. I'm not sure if you did in the 2014 book, but so I wonder, do you? I mean, one of the main reasons motivating that approach is that phenomenologically, it seems that conscious experience comes with a kind of awareness of that conscious experience, that we're aware in some sense of all of our phenomenally conscious experiences. So do you, and that's a phenomenological datum, some people think, and I'm wondering what your take on that might be.
Yeah, that's a very, very difficult question. Another one, by the way.
Sorry.
No. I mean, that has a long history, tradition in philosophy. I don't need to tell you. Self-consciousness, Kant, self-awareness, different forms of apperception, empirical, transcendental. I mean, it's a mess. Yeah. Even phenomenology speaks of a pre-reflective self-consciousness.
Right.
And to be honest, this is so I cannot really give you a definitive answer to that. However, I come from a different angle. I come from an angle where, as a psychiatrist, I see patients who have experience which are inexplicable. You become depressed and they don't really know. Depressed, I mean really depression, when you need to see me as a psychiatrist, which I'm sure.
Right.
Yeah, but it's inexplicable. In the early stages of schizophrenia, something changes and they can't find a word for it. But there is an experience. There's absolutely an experience in a phenomenological sense, but I think they're not aware of the experience as experience and so on. So if you want to say, so it's an experience, it's a pre-phenomenal, phenomenal experience. There's not yet a full-blown intentionality. There might be a pre-intentionality. There is not yet a full-blown qualia. That comes when you have the symptoms of schizophrenia. So maybe there's some kind of pre-qualia. So what I'm doing here philosophically, Husserl extended the reflective component, what you just said, the awareness of the awareness, to a pre-reflective level.
Right.
I'm saying maybe, Husserl, brilliant idea, but maybe you need to go even one step further down to a pre-phenomenal level, a basic form of experience. You find this, I mean, as surprisingly as it is, you find it in Kant, the concept of experience all over. It is not related to consciousness. Another person where you find the concept of experience in a very basic, raw way is Whitehead. Yeah. So this is what I'm targeting, because I need to account for these patients' experiences.
Right.
Yeah? That's much of my approach, particularly my neuroscientific approach to consciousness, is guided by that, because I need to get their neuronal mechanism and then hopefully provide some therapy for them. So that's basically, I would extend that to a pre-phenomenal level. I do this in the 2014 book, in the Unlocking, where I speak of a pre-phenomenal level. Yeah.
And so when you say pre-phenomenal experience, there's, from the patient's point of view, there is something that it's like for them to have that pre-phenomenal experience, or there isn't?
There is an experience, exactly. So they're not aware of that, but their coordinates, their relationship to the world, to their own body changes. The relationship of their thoughts, sometimes, which we usually take for granted, a sort of Polanyi, tacit knowledge, Michael Polanyi, tacit knowledge, that becomes suddenly disrupted. Yeah, certain certainties which we usually take for granted become disrupted. And that's what I say. But they still experience. And that's why it's so painful. I mean, these people suffer like hell.
Yeah.
Yeah? So you cannot say there is no consciousness. Otherwise, they wouldn't suffer. Yeah.
Right. I mean, so this is kind of a debate in the philosophy of psychiatry about whether you take someone that has a delusional belief, like, Cotard syndrome or something that's really pretty extreme. And so some people would say, well, their experience has changed, and so their beliefs are a rational response to the change in experience. Whereas other people would say experientially nothing has changed, they just have a disorder at the cognitive level. So it sounds like what you're arguing for is that the first interpretation.
Yes. So we have data now, and it's part already published, that we're looking for this deeper level. For instance, in schizophrenia, there's the assumption of a basic self-disturbance. Yeah. And we show that this basic self-disturbance cannot be explained by cognitive dysfunction of working memory, attention. So it's a deeper level, which is hidden. Yeah, that's what I like to call in the consciousness debate, the neural predispositions of consciousness. Yeah. And it's a deeper level. And that's probably the dynamic level. Yeah. When you're on the surfer, let's say, again, I don't surf. That's why my examples are not good there. But nevertheless, so look at the surfer again. The surfer stands on the surfboard. Yeah. And usually you just see the surfer, but you don't see how much the surfboard adapts, is flexible to the waveform, to the continuous shape.
Right.
That's the kind of level I'm targeting. And without that adaptation of the surfboard to the continuously changing waveform, the surfer could not surf. That's the level I'm targeting in psychiatric patients. There's an experience for that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. So I think that's, and I really like this idea that we should be guided by trying to help people. And our theories of consciousness should have some contact with lived experiences. And if it doesn't help us understand these kinds of psychiatric disorders, and then it's not really clear what interest the theory itself has. So I really appreciate this kind of emphasis on practical and pragmatic results, and using this to help people. So I just wanted to mention that. So I wonder if I could switch gears just slightly and ask, because I mean, in your book, you say you want to moving from the mind-body problem to the world-brain problem. And I'm going to ask you about that shortly, but I noticed one thing that didn't occur is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And I'm wondering is why, so do you think that that's just synonymous with the mind-body problem, or the question of why is there any experience associated with these things that we're talking about? That's the way I would interpret the hard problem. It's certainly possible, it's seemingly conceptually at least, to have all the stuff that we're talking about and yet no experience whatsoever, and at all. And so some people think we need to give an account of why these processes are accompanied by any kind of experience. So do you think that's the same problem as the mind-body problem, or do you think that's not a problem at all? Or so I'm wondering what your response is to that.
I never thought it this way. So I do think that they're separate problems. It's not the same.
Okay.
First, I mean, it's very simple. The first one is about consciousness. The second one is about the mind. That's clear. The mind is much more than just consciousness. It's often boiled down. There is consciousness, free will, there is emotional feeling. These are all phenomena of mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? And I think the mind, let's say my level, what I coined experience, it's broader than the current concept of consciousness, but it's still a mental feature. Yeah. So mental features, remember what I said earlier with this virtual time-space expansion going beyond the physical, that I would say is mental. So I have a very basic, very broad concept of mental here. By mind, you see, before giving you, I don't give you an answer to the problem. I will not give you a question. You see that. But what you will see, I will analyze the terms, see their context, and then I say, maybe the question is not plausible. And that's the case I want to make for both problems. And I try to keep it short. So the hard problem is why there is consciousness rather than non-consciousness. Yeah, that's the way I understand. I know there are different formulations around about it, but let's keep it for that way.
Yeah.
Unless you want to bring another formulation. So yes, I think it's, for me, this is basically an ontological question. So you can keep that same question also in a metaphysical context. And that's the way I think Sharma's originally envisioned it. For him, ontology / the natural world is just one subset of the broader logical world and metaphysics. However, because in that sense, he's a very traditional philosopher, I see where he's coming from. I would say, for me, this is at best an ontological problem, but not a metaphysical or purely philosophical problem. Yeah. So I sharply distinguish between ontology and metaphysics, that say what applies to the natural world does not necessarily need to apply also to the logical world. Yeah, because you have logical worlds that are distinct from the natural world. So that is one way to go for that.
Right.
So then I say, okay, what kind of ontology do I need in order to account for consciousness and the occurrence of consciousness in the natural world? Then I say, yes, I do not think that a property-based ontology works. Meaning, I do not think that there are special mental entities in the world, properties, or substances. So substances, Descartes, mental properties, much prevalent still in current philosophy of mind. I don't think that any such substance property-based ontology works. So that already means, because I think you can assume that it's logically conceivable, but I don't think it's empirically plausible given the data of the brain. Because what the brain does is continuously relate different time and space scales, and there's no fixed property. You cannot distinguish. So I would argue, and that's what I do in the book you mentioned, it's really that we need a relation-based ontology. So the basic units of existence in reality are relation. And that then where I say maybe we need to conceive, we can do this later, the brain as a relational organ to body and world. So basically I say, in order to answer the hard problem, I say, yes, consciousness is there because there's a world-brain relationship. If that world-brain relationship ceases, or like in coma, you lose consciousness. That's the empirical support of an ontological assumption where consciousness is based on a relation-based rather than property-based ontology. So now the mind-body problem. So here I start with a conceptual level. So the possibility of raising the question of the mind-body problem is that you presuppose the conceivability of mind. The mind must be possible. Even if you deny the mind, like Churchill in Eliminativism, you still must presuppose the conceivability of mind, a possible mind as distinguished from an actual mind. So now that's a conceptual stand. That's a conceptual presupposition of the mind-body. And then, of course, if you presuppose the conceivability of mind, then the next question comes, how is the mind related to the body?
Right.
So now I consider the feasibility of that presupposition of the conceivability of mind. And I say, as an ontologist, as a philosopher of the natural world, not a metaphysician, not the logical world. In the logical world, the mind might be logically conceivable, Chalmers. In the natural world, I said there's no evidence, neither ontologically nor empirically, for the possibility or conceivability of mind. And if I say it's completely implausible to assume the mind, then maybe the question resulting from the conceivability assumption also needs to be discarded, dissolved. So the question for the mind-body relationship might be a logically conceivable question, yes, when you assume the conceivability of mind, but empirically it's not plausible. Yeah, because basically I question the question itself, because I say it's not empirically, ontologically plausible. But then, of course, I need to look, how do I can account for mental features? Because before I did a distinction between mental features and mind.
So, I mean, this is why sometimes I think you get accused of being an identity theorist. I know you deny that, but it sounds like so I'm an old-fashioned guy. I sort of like the identity theory. I defend it here and there. It's not. I don't know if it's true or not, but I kind of like it. So, for someone like me, it sounds like what you're saying is, look, by mind, what I mean is some kind of substance or a certain property, and I don't think those things work. So I'm going to say those don't exist. I'm going to be a limitativist about that conception of the mental. But then why isn't it the case that what you're doing is offering a different view of what the mind is, as opposed to saying, I want to get rid of it? Because one could say that, well, the mental is, because it's very hard for me to understand what it means to separate consciousness from the mind, or from some. So I know what it would mean to say there's no substance that has that characteristic, but it seems like mentality, intentionality, consciousness, these things are all clustered together. So I'm wondering what would be wrong with interpreting your view as a redefinition of what the mind is, as opposed to an elimination of it.
Let's say, yeah, I mean, okay, if you say, of course, that all depends upon what you mean by mind. Yeah,
right.
This is clear. If you say, okay, mind is mental features, then of course my thesis is, then your mind-body problem is basically a problem between body and mental features. Fine,
right.
I have no problem with that. I would have no problems with that. However, however, there's an important twist to this. When you say I'm an identity theorist, I would say no. Because your identity, the assumption of the identity theory is one of the many possibilities of resulting from the mind-body problem. And that's where I say the consequences of an implausible problem are as implausible as the problem itself. So basically, for me, it's an escape to get away from these conceptual alternatives of identity, supervenience, panpsychism, and so on and so on.
Right.
Yeah, if you want to categorize me, yes, I'm a relationalist, world-brain relation-based ontology, and I'm a spatial-temporalist, because I think that mental features have a spatial-temporal basis in the world and how it's related to the brain. So if you want to get that, but neither of that, and I didn't argue all that in that book, because of course, otherwise I would be completely crazy, because it would be double as long, yeah. But ultimately, the basic thing is that the possibility of these different answers, identity theory, supervenient, all presuppose a mind-body problem, which for me rests on an implausible assumption. So now you can say, Northoff, this is a pocket gambler trick, as we would say in Germany. However, fine, you can say that, but at least what I want to open the conceptual landscape.
Right.
Yeah, so I open the conceptual, even if I say Northoff, you're all wrong, but I open the conceptual landscape for including relationism, for spatial temporalism. And now we have to see what subsequent generation and people see whether it's empirically plausible what I'm doing. Yeah, and ontologically and logically conceivable what I'm doing. And if that support is given, great. If not, you are not off, then you need to modify.
Right.
So I just basically want to open the landscape, say, look, there's an alternative to raising these questions and to broaden your scope of possible answers. That's basically what I'm trying to do. The same.
Yeah, and
Copernicus broadened the scope of possible answer to the relationship between Earth and universe. Kepler, Galilei, and so on could confirm that. Great. I'm waiting for those guys.
Exactly. And I appreciate that way of putting the problem, because it does seem, I mean, one of the thoughts that I had when I was reading through this was that it does seem like there is a mind-body type problem which results from your view. So if you take your view on board, then there still is this question, which is, I mean, it's not exactly the world brain problem, although I'm not 100% clear whether this is right. But anyway, there's this question of how these mental features have their causal powers in the body, how they relate to the body itself, how these relational features between the world and the body have their effects. And that's a version of, it's something like an analog of a mind-body problem, wouldn't you? A mental feature body problem or something like that.
Yeah, but yeah, so there's two shifts in there. So first, of course, the shift from mind to mental features, which, okay, we covered already. And the second shift is here that I say, and that is crucial. This is in chapter 10, what I'm doing. If you just say body mental features, so, okay, let me start another way. The main thing, Thomas Nagel points it out in wonderful papers, 1998, conceivability. So what you need is a necessary relationship between the ontological features and consciousness. Yeah?
Yeah.
And the main problem is that current accounts, also for the whole mind-body debate, that there's no necessary relationship between the body or the brain and the mental features. They're all contingent. That's the main, for me, the main conceptual epistemological problem.
Right.
Whether that necessity is a priori or a posteriori, Kripke, is a second question. Yeah. So, and my argument is that if you limit your view to body or brain, also in all the embodiment, embeddedness theories, you will not find the necessary connection of that feature, ontological feature, to consciousness. Yeah. That's why I say you need to bring in the world. You need to bring in how the brain is part of the world through the body, alignment, temporal spatial alignment. And that provides you, because the necessary relationship, and that is a two-step proof. First, you can show that the brain is necessarily related to the world because it's part of the whole. It's a mereological support, if you want to say so. So conceptually, that's a necessity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you want to assume the brain is not part of the world. Okay, then we're in metaphysics. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not doing that yet. Yeah.
Then, if you can show that that necessary relationship in turn makes possible the necessary relationship of brain to consciousness, then you have the link, the necessity relationship. Yeah, and you overcame the contingency. However, that necessity isn't, as I would argue with Kripke and Nagel, is an a posteriori necessity, is not a priori. And that's a tricky thing. That's what we're missing in the current debate, because they all look for an a priori necessity, and then they have all these theories, identity theory, blah, 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 and they all turn out to be contingent. Yeah. So for me, I subscribe this under the contingency problem. Yeah, and that chapter is chapter 10 in the spontaneous brain, that you can't imagine how much labor that chapter cost me. It made me psychotic. Yeah? It's because it's so difficult, but I'm somewhat convinced that I think that's the way to go. And then if you have these necessities, conceptually, then you can see whether there's empirical plausibility for that. Yeah. So
there's a couple of things I want to ask you about what you're saying right there, but one of them has to do with the relationalism. And I like structural realism, by the way, so I was really happy to see that you brought that in. And I like the moderate form of structural realism that you argue for in the book. I'm a fan of that approach in general. In physics, I like ontic structural realism. So anyway, so I was very happy to see that connection. But it does make me wonder about some of the things that you were saying about, like, locked-in syndrome, for example. So you talk about the case where you have the person, they're locked in, seemingly in a coma. You tell them, imagine playing tennis. They see in the supplementary motor area some activity. Walk through your house, you see activity in spatially relevant locations in the brain. And I thought you were saying that this is evidence that they're conscious of what's going on, but the relation with the world is missing at that point. So I'm wondering how we reconcile those two aspects of what you're saying.
Yeah, very good question. I would say locked-in syndrome, they are right. They have no motor relationship to the world. That's true. It's blocked. Like in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, they lose all their muscle function. They cannot move anymore. True. However, their sensory processing is probably, and their sensory alignment to the world is probably still there. And we are trying now studies where we show this, where we compare locked-in syndrome versus anesthesia and so on and so on. So the basic sensory input processing with which we started our conversation today is still prevalent there. And that's your alignment to the world. So when these people listen to music, they cannot dance to the rhythm physically, but probably mentally they still do. Whereas if you're in coma, you cannot listen to the rhythm of the music. You don't listen to the rhythm of the music anymore, and there's no mental dancing anymore.
I see. Yeah. So it's that
alignment. Yeah.
It's any kind of connection to the world that's gonna
Exactly.
play this role. So I guess I was thinking too much about movement and affordances and those sorts of things, which are part of the story, I think, in your view, but not the whole story.
It's not the whole. I mean, these are extreme cases where you have a decoupling between sensory and motor, which we usually use exactly for the kind of things what you're doing, affordances, relationship, ecological niche, Gibson and others. But here you still have the sensory alignment. You don't have motor.
Right.
Yes, but there's still a connection. Whereas one of the most impressive people, when we did a lot of research, brain imaging on these patients who lose consciousness, comatose, vegetative state, anesthesia, and also now in sleep. And when I saw these comatose patients, because their motor functions are still there, they still show reflexive movement. But I was always asking myself, why don't these people behave? Why does their motor activity does not transform into action or behavior? Right. So what is action and behavior? What are they about? They are about of relating to yourself in a virtual way to the world. Yeah. When you're standing in when you're doing an action, you immediately have a sort of a virtual 3D coordinate system of the world and yourself as part of that. You're part of the music. You're aligned to the rhythm of the music. And it's the same way. And that's what I mean by relationship to the world. You align yourself to the world, and then you can go with the world. Like the surfer moves properly to align the surfboard to the wave, and then she or he can surf. Same with consciousness. In a way, consciousness is like surfing on the time-space dynamics of the world, mediated by your brain.
But cool, that's a nice metaphor. I mean, I was always more into skating than surfing, so I'd prefer a skating metaphor. But it's the same. It's the same idea. But so this makes me wonder, like, what we're going to say, or what would you say about? Well, I mean, in a kind of ordinary case like dreaming experience, but then also like sensory deprivation, where people in sensory deprivation experience like really radical hallucinations under some cases if it's done too long and so forth. I mean, there's no, you can't rely on the sensory connection. Or are you going to say that they're still sensing like pitch darkness? Right? Yeah. So what are we going to say about these kinds of cases?
Yeah. So I do think, and schizophrenia is another example of that, obviously. Yeah, you still have a virtual connection to the world built up. So your sensory cortex is not only active when you get external input. Your sensory cortex is continuously active even in the absence of external input. So now, in dreams, your visual cortex does not receive much external input anymore. However, all the 4 other sensory regions are still, channels are still open, even in dreams. So you're not as disconnected from the world as it is often taken to be. Yeah, that's an important thing, because you still wake up. When there's noise, you wake up, your dreams are interrupted, or you incorporate that into your dreams.
Right, yeah.
So that's, it's not as sensory deconnected. However, you're right, I need to account for that. I would argue that your visual cortex is just spontaneously active and creates a virtual sensory input. Like your auditory cortex in auditory hallucination. It's a virtual auditory input where the spontaneous activity is not properly suppressed. And the spontaneous activity in auditory cortex in schizophrenia becomes as high as doing an external input in the healthy state. Right. So if your activity, your spontaneous activity is as high as doing normally an external input, of course, then you think there's a voice. And that indeed can be shown and has been shown.
Yeah, but doesn't that put pressure on the relationalism? Because if you can have the conscious experience without the relation, but just a virtual relation or as if relation, then couldn't you do that in the normal case too?
I would argue that, let's say, if that person never from birth on was sensory deprived, she or he, it's like the Mary argument now, yeah?
Right, yeah.
Would not develop auditory hallucination. But I know the ground is very slippery. I know that. So and the other, the conceptual escape, I do. Or you really present me with heart problems, yeah. And
sorry.
no. This is, I like that. So
Okay, good.
The conceptual escape would be what you're saying are different levels of empirical relation, but that is grounded ultimately on an ontological relation. And the case when I said that you were deprived from the early on, you were never related to the world, then you probably really relax that ontological relationship. So I think that conceptually I would make a careful distinction between empirical, which can have different degrees of relation, and the ontological.
Right.
You cannot infer from a low level of empirical relation to the absence of ontological relation. Kant already accused Locke of a physiological inference. Yeah, it's
right.
And I would do the same. You cannot infer from the empirical to the ontological. And I think it's often done in the current debate. It's sort of, yeah, so that's where I keep these levels somewhat distinct. It's very important for me as a non-reductive neurophilosopher.
Right, that's the non-reductive part, right?
Yeah.
So what about like I don't know how distracted I want to get by this because I can't keep you forever, but this is really interesting to me. So like if you take like these poor kittens who have their eyes sewed shut when they're born, and then they unsew them. I take it these kittens, I don't know what it's like to be one of these cats, I haven't had it done, but they have deficits, they have visual deficits. They don't develop normal vision, but they do seemingly have some visual responses. So maybe they have a kind of disorganized kind of visual experience without object or something like that. But there's a case where you might say they've never had this kind of world relation, but yet there's still a kind of visual experience, which is possible. Would that be a kind of challenge to review, or would you say that there's a way of accounting for that?
Yeah, first I would need to know the empirical details. I mean, let's say, on the other hand, let's say I would cite cases like Kaspar Hauser.
No.
Or remember very tragic examples, 1989, when Romania was opening and they had all these orphans. Yeah, they were completely deprived. They were always there in the orphanage home.
Yeah.
And they were basically like vegetables. And they never really had a proper relation to the outside world. And they could never really develop proper consciousness because the temporal spatial structuring organization from the environment of your brain spontaneous activity was not there.
Right.
So they have a very rudimentary form of consciousness, if at all, but this is not complex, not organized, not structured, nothing. That's why I would say, so these would be for me cases of a minimal relationship. And and maybe there's, of course, you have a minimal consciousness, maybe evolutionary there, but that's what I would say. So I would cite those cases in support of my relationism. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it throws a whole new light on, like, think about Plato's cave, right? These guys are not going to have sort of normal experiences on this sort of.
I love that. I love that. So you could infer they had all these strange philosophical theses because they had no alignment to the world, sitting there in their. Don't tell them.
Yeah.
Don't tell the Greek specialists. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask you about, well, a couple of things, but one I want to ask you about, there's a part of your book where you talk about a difference day ray, a difference day say.
Okay.
With respect to, you're talking about, so part of the problem is this kind of, you're dealing with a kind of circularity objection to your view, that you say that the brain requires a relation to the world. It's kind of ontic, it's part of its structure, but that presupposes the existence of the brain already. So you introduce in the course of that this I mean, maybe it's the next section after. I might be slightly misremembering the sequence there, but you know better than I do. But so this has to do with your
Sorry,
the
just
way.
one second. Yeah, okay. I'm in the middle of the interview.
They're good.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Okay, they called?
No, I called.
Okay, you will pick up the bread? Yeah, okay, and buy some milk. Maybe
I'm
there's
not
some-
going to buy anything. I can't even call it cancel if you.
No, okay, thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. I'm
Okay,
not gonna-
okay, sorry.
No
Okay.
worries, no problem at all.
Okay.
Do you need to go? Is this
No,
something that you-
it's fine, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to impinge too much if keep you if you have other things going on. So you need milk.
It's not so easy these days, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about because a lot, I mean, this goes all the way back to the beginning of the book, and this is now towards the end, but you're making an argument that the way the brain encodes information is in terms of differences. And so then you introduce these two different kinds of differences. The day, I think it's day ray, right? And day say, or per se, it's a difference per se. And
Exactly.
yeah, right. So can you say a little bit about what that distinction is and how it's working here?
Yeah, so that really goes to the heart of a relation-based ontology. That's why it's so important.
Yes.
So when you say differences, you would assume, yes, okay, let's say we have two time points, T1 and T2, and then you encode the difference between T1 and T2. Yeah. And then you would argue, yes, however, your difference-based coding is not ontologically, because you presuppose that first the brain must encode T1 and then T2, and then it can code the difference. If you say that difference are really basic and fundamental, that's circular, because you need to assume T1 and T2 in order to be able to assume difference. Yeah,
right.
Difference-based coding. So, and that goes really, so, and that ultimately, if you say now extend it to the ontological level, if you have to first assume T1 and T2 and then difference-based, you end up with a property-based ontology. Yeah,
right.
Because you first assume the properties of T1, the properties of T2, and then the difference. Somebody who is caught in that, and it would be nice to trace it down, is Leibniz, because he goes quite way far in his concept of time, in a very well, but ontologically, he goes back to the monads.
Right.
And nobody knows what these damn monads are, because it's such a hybrid constellation. You see how the current concept can be traced to history. So this is Leibniz, in a way, in that sense, he's much more interesting than Kant. So now, how to get rid of these monads? So the differences based on T1, T2, these are the difference, empirical differences. Yeah, this is what you observe, how you calculate differences. Right. However, if you want to have that ontologically, you cannot assume T1, T2. Ontologically, you must assume that T1 and T2 are a consequence of the basic differences. And that's, of course, completely crazy to think, because that's not the way we think. However, right. I would argue here now, you have differences, and T1 and T2 are abstractions from that differences. So the differences are ontological. T1 and T2 are epistemological, are abstractions. This is the way how we, based on our brain, can and must approach the reality. We are not able to directly grasp differences as such. We can only try to measure them indirectly. And that's what we're currently doing in our brain stuff. I have all kinds of measures which really measure the differences between slow and fast frequencies, scale-free activity for the experts. Yeah, the differences between two different time points, autocorrelation window for the experts. So I really use difference-based measures. And then the time points are, of course, operationally prior, true, but ontologically, they follow. Yeah, and that's the difference de re is exactly where differences, primary and fundamental, T1 and T2 are abstractions, are inferences from those differences. This is basically like our brain scanner. We get insight into the time through T1 and T2, but ultimately what we see, what that is a difference. The same way the brain scanner, the colorful brain which we get out of the fMRI doesn't mean that the brain itself is colorful.
Right.
Meaning that the time we measure at T1 and T2 doesn't mean that time is nothing but a sequence of T1 and T2. Same thing.
Right. So the idea is that one's an epistemic and one's an ontological.
Exactly. One is methodological, one is methodological, epistemological, one is ontological. And I think that's very important. My feeling is that that is often confused in philosophy of mind these days, also in neuroscience.
Yeah.
And I think a person who also gets all these levels together and confused is again, of course, my beloved Kant. Yeah. Yeah. But I think one can learn a lot from him in that sense. Yeah?
Right. So, I mean, I know you spent a lot of time talking about time towards the end of the book, and that was some of the hardest reading for me, I think. But so what I mean, I don't want to ask you like what is time on this view, but it's almost like I do want to ask you what ultimately, if it's not a sequence or a series, a succession of events, then how are we understanding this ontologically temporal aspect of the view?
Ooh, that's a real Pandora's box here. Okay.
Yeah.
I completely agree. The notion of time is underdeveloped in that book, but I don't need to tell you that would require another book. And this is on my list. It's on my list, the notion of time. Let me start again with another empirical example that gives you an idea how I conceive the notion of time. So when you mental time travel, yeah. So there's solid empirical evidence now, and also in psychiatric patients, that there's no clear separation between past, present, and future. Your past always extends into the future, and also the past, into the past. Typical example: you listen to music, you hear the tone at this point in time, and you hear it relative to indifference to the tone in the past, and you already start anticipating the next tone.
Right.
And a good composer is the one who sometimes lets you anticipate the right thing, and sometimes she or he violates your anticipation. Beethoven is master in that. Master. Yeah. So, and that makes the fun of listening for music, at least for me. Yeah. So now, what does your brain do? So your brain, the composer, he doesn't compose the melody. He just composed some tones. However, the good composer, he knows your brain. He knows what your brain does with the tone she or he composes. So the good composer puts the tones in such a way together that you perceive a melody. Yeah, Prokofiev, another master in that, with the dissonances deep down. It's unbelievable. Yeah. So, and so meaning your brain puts things together across our distinction of past, future, and present. So again, past, future, and present are probably abstractions, epistemological concept, for us to better operationalize, conceive reality. However, it doesn't mean that reality itself conforms to that. So then you can say, maybe Northoff, you seem to be a presentism. Yeah. That goes, you have a dynamic view of time, for sure. That goes back to Leibniz. Leibniz has a fantastic view of comparing the Chinese philosopher. So it's a dynamic view of time. Time consists in change of time, and time exists only as long as there's change. Yeah, so it's a very Henri Bergson, some people, Gilles Deleuze, if you look for some philosophical predecessors, Leibniz, obviously, some of that you can also see in Heidegger, but Heidegger, for him, time is always existential, which I would not share because I aim to describe the time of the world independent of us and ourselves. Because that I need to do in order to understand then how the brain is part of the world, participates in the time of the world. Yeah, the brain doesn't construct its own time, it just participates in the ongoing time construction of the world. So now I'm speaking real as an ontologist, yeah, not as a
Right. Yeah, so I mean, you have to do a lot of work. I mean, obviously, that's why a whole second book, but so making that compatible with physics as we understand it currently. I mean, not just relativity physics, which a lot of people take to be the premise in an argument against positivism. I'm not necessarily someone who agrees with that, but I think that it's a challenge there. But also, if you look at our deeper physics like string theory and stuff like that, there are some people who think that at the fundamental level, notions of space and time itself may not be relevant at the deepest microphysical levels. So so I mean, there's a lot that would have to be said about how you're going to make it compatible with those kinds of.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, there in the physics community, the trend is also going Lee Smolin for dynamic time, and actually Lee Smolin and I work together on some of these things.
Okay, I didn't know that.
He likes this, what I'm doing on the brain stuff. It can links it to his physics stuff of dynamic time. So
interesting.
No doubt. You mentioned the different levels. There's a deeper level, there's no time and space. I would probably argue the micro level is just a very small time and space scale. Yeah, and that's what I'm doing in the MIT book. I say that's a nestedness. It's like the Russian dolls. The world is the biggest Russian doll, and then there are all kinds of different Russian dolls. And the smallest, maybe just an abstraction. And we perceive it as if there is no time and space.
Right.
Yeah? But it still might be a very nano, milli, blah, blah, blah time scale, which we cannot grasp. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I see we're really running out of time now, but I wanted to ask it. This is switching gears completely, but I wanted to ask about your views about artificial consciousness and whether you're a skeptic or so. If we built a machine which had these same sorts of dynamical relations to the world, would it also be conscious on your view, or is this something that only brains can do?
No, I'm not a brain fetishist. Absolutely not. It may look like that I speak of world-brain relation, but I could also be a world-agent relation. Yeah?
Okay.
However, that agent must have spontaneous time-space dynamics. Yeah, a spontaneous or resting state activity. That agent must have an internal space-time hierarchy, topography, which current agents don't have.
Right.
And so that the two dimension, it must have spontaneous activity. Second, it must have a space-time dynamics. Third, that space-time dynamic must be relevant, must be manifest in a certain very elaborate hierarchies of time-space dynamics, meaning there must be many Russian dolls within the brain itself. Yeah, like the different regions, like the different waves, slow, fast waves. Yeah, and the fourth condition, even more important, that time and space hierarchy must be shapeable and plastic by the environmental context. Yeah, I just had this morning in a Skype with a colleague from Denmark, and he told me that many of his psychotic patients now have coronavirus hallucinations. They have delusions about the coronavirus. I mean, they just think it's just 3-4 weeks ago, and they immediately react. So these guys are very aligned to the world and context sensitive. Right. However, they mold this into their own internal beliefs, and then this delusion. So you see how much the spontaneous activity is shaped by your respective environmental context. Maybe not in the millisecond, maybe not in a second, but over stretches of 10, 20 seconds, and of course then much longer, minutes, hours, blah, 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 longer time scales, yes.
Right. Oh, and this would be the same would hold true if in a simulated world. As long as you had all of these relevant features, you would say you could be conscious in a simulation.
You could have an experience if the world is a context. So that agent must relate to the context. And the context must be spatio-temporally more richer and more extended than the agent itself. If it's just one-to-one, I don't think there will happen much. Because it's this asymmetry. The brain is a smaller doll with a more limited space and time scale than the world. Let's say seismic earthquake. They have time scales which we cannot conceive. Yeah?
Right.
And it is that asymmetric relationship which I think makes it possible for us to experience ourselves as part of a wider world. And that is consciousness for me about. Consciousness for me is about you experience yourself as part of a wider world with as a certain perspective. Yeah, you have a point of view. Thomas Nagel. What is it like to be a man? He doesn't speak of first-person perspective distinguished from third. He speaks of a point of view which locates you in a virtual way in the world. And that's what I'm trying to explain. That's why I come about this world-brain relationships thing. That's the ultimate. Yeah, and in my
so this could.
That just one psychiatric patient, I see that distort. They have distorted consciousness of themselves as part of the world. I described this in an earlier book, Neurophilosophy and the Healthy Mind. Yeah, so it's really, and that leads my view of consciousness strongly.
So this could happen. I mean, because this could happen in a simulated world. It could also happen like in the Cartesian demon world, where the Cartesian demon is simulating all of the external stuff, right? It seems like it also happened in an idealism world.
One second.
Hello? Okay, it's good. Let's go. We can continue.
Sorry. Okay. But it can also happen in a world where idealism was true, where all there was minds.
Again, say again. I didn't get that.
Oh, I'm just so it seems like, you know, the kind of relationalism that you're talking about could hold in a computer simulated world as long as it was done the right way. It could be true in a world where idealism was true, like absolute idealism. So there's nothing really physicalist necessarily about the physical world that's important. It's about just the context and the agent's relationship.
Exactly, space-time dynamics. So it holds. So I would very clearly say the criterion in spatial-temporal dynamical environment. Yeah, in a world, whether that world is a real, graspable physical world or a virtual 3D virtual reality world, fine, no problem for me. The main criterion is space-time dynamics. Spatial temporal nestedness, spatial temporal directedness, what I do in the MIT book, and the kind of things. Spatial temporal hierarchy, I would add now, spatial temporal relationships, what I explained, these kind of things. And you need a certain frequency range. So let's say if you have only slow waves, only one big slow wave frequency, you will probably also not be able to surf. Yeah, you need also the faster wave. You need a certain frequency range. And that probably the extent of your possible consciousness, the range.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I see I'm really running you out of overtime here, and you're really busy. So I'm going to let you go. But I do want to ask you as a final question, if there's anything which hasn't come up, which you wished had come up. And the answer can be no, but I just wonder if there's anything we haven't talked about which you were hoping would come up.
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. We covered the ground from the brain to the world-brain relation. And the ontological, you covered the mind-body problem, the heart problem. You located me, you try to locate me in the current literature, which is very good. I appreciate that because it looks a little bit out there, but you see, I also always try to bring the references to others to see that it looks very far out what I'm doing, but it's deeply embedded in that, trying to find an answer. And the next step, which is the last chapters of the MIT book, is this Copernican revolution, but that's a different topic. But yeah, I think what I just want to see, how much, I think that also became clear throughout this interview, how much conceptual, methodological, ontological, and empirical issues go hand in hand, albeit they cannot be reduced to each other. Yeah. I think that's one of the main where I'm always getting surprised. Oops, what's going on here? Yeah, and that gives you a broader landscape of novel alternatives, of viewing the same thing. Yeah,
right.
It opens the door, and that's what I'm trying to do. And now I try to gather a lot of empirical evidence supporting some of these views.
Yeah, well, and I was going to get to the Copernican stuff, but we're running really out of time, so we'll have to save that for later someday. But I don't want to say thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time and willingness to have these conversations. And I think the conceptual landscape that you're trying to open up is one that needs more attention. So I think it's very nice to see people like you working on this stuff, trying to bring in careful considerations from the neuroscience, but also connecting it to the history of philosophy, to current philosophy. So I wish more people had that kind of ear for all three of those topics, and not to mention like helping people as well. So I think it's really cool what you're doing. I really appreciate it. And even though I might not agree 100%, I think thinking about it from your point of view is really challenging and fruitful.
I appreciate very much. One thing just for us would be nice if you, I wrote a textbook, Minding the Brain, where some of these things are sort of indicated. They go not as crazy, but that might be a good entrance, Minding the Brain,
Okay.
2014, which would be nice also for an interdisciplinary audience written.
And that's a textbook? Like you could use it in the class?
Minding the Brain, a guide to neuroscience and philosophy. And I sketched some phenomenology, analytic philosophy, how that involves question with neuroscience. So it really goes beyond the analytic philosophy ground, but I think it could be a very good textbook used in undergraduate, graduate classes, has been translated into Chinese and will be translated into Italian.
Wow. Yeah, I teach a class called Science, Humanism, and Technology, and I think a book like that might be perfect. I'll have to check it out for sure.
That's basically
I hadn't seen that one.
Yeah, it's a non-reductive approach to all of this. Yeah, the brain and philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out. I'll put a link up on the website too. But so thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and end this now, and then just hang on for a second. I'll say bye to you off the air.
Okay.